I always had a fascination with the unknown, and that was what led me to embark on the ill-fated journey that haunts my nightmares to this day. It was a moonless night, the sky a blanket of inky blackness as I set out to drive across a desolate stretch of highway. My destination was a remote town, said to be haunted by a dark and tragic past. The stories surrounding it were chilling, but I was determined to experience the thrill of venturing into the unknown. The road ahead stretched like a never-ending ribbon, flanked on both sides by towering trees that seemed to reach out and grasp at the darkness. The only company I had was the eerie glow of my headlights, casting eerie shadows along the deserted highway. With every passing mile, I felt a growing sense of unease, as though an unseen presence was observing my every move. My radio had mysteriously lost signal, leaving me with only the sound of my own breathing and the faint hum of the engine. The isolation of the road weighed heavily on my mind, and a sudden feeling of dread crept over me. My instincts urged me to turn back, but my curiosity pushed me forward. As I continued my drive, the sense of unease intensified, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The darkness seemed to grow thicker, suffocating me with each passing moment. To add to my apprehension, the road ahead seemed unfamiliar, despite having driven it countless times before. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance, standing motionless in the middle of the road. My heart pounded in my chest as I squinted to get a better look. The figure seemed ethereal, a spectral silhouette framed by the dim glow of my headlights. Panic set in, and I slammed my foot on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. But as my car came to a halt, the figure vanished into thin air. Confused and frightened, I rubbed my eyes, thinking it might have been a trick of the mind. I was ready to attribute it to exhaustion and stress, but the unsettling feeling persisted. Deciding that I couldn't dwell on the strange encounter, I resumed driving, though more cautiously this time. The miles dragged on, each bend in the road unveiling a new fear, and the looming trees seemed to whisper malevolently. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but my thoughts were becoming erratic, my imagination running wild. A sudden movement to my right caught my attention, a fleeting glimpse of a pale face staring at me through the passenger window. My heart raced, and I swerved instinctively. When I dared to look back, there was nothing there, just the endless expanse of darkness. By now, my nerves were frayed, and I longed for the comfort of civilization. The GPS on my phone had lost signal, leaving me with no sense of direction. I didn't recognize anything around me, as though I had entered a realm untouched by time and reality. Then, I noticed a faint glow in the distance, like a beacon of hope. Relief washed over me as I assumed it must be a gas station or a small town. But as I drew closer, the glow transformed into something sinister. A group of people, dressed in archaic garments, stood in a circle around a flickering fire. Their faces were obscured by shadow, but their presence exuded an aura of malevolence. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to escape from whatever dark ritual was unfolding before me, but my curiosity had long taken control. I couldn't explain the magnetic pull that compelled me to stop the car and step out. The night air was cold and heavy, and the chanting of the figures grew louder, echoing inside my head. I felt like a moth drawn to a deadly flame. They turned toward me in unison, their eyes reflecting the dancing flames with an unnatural gleam. My heart threatened to burst from my chest, but I was paralyzed, unable to move a muscle. I was trapped in their gaze, held captive by an otherworldly force. Then one of them stepped forward, his face finally illuminated by the fire's glow. His eyes were empty voids, and a sinister grin crept across his pale lips. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body refused to obey. I finally found the strength to turn and flee, my body fueled by adrenaline and terror. I ran back to my car, jumped inside, and slammed the door shut. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the ignition, praying for the engine to roar to life. With a screech of tires, I sped away from the haunting scene, the night now alive with malevolent energy. As I drove, I could feel their eyes on me, their presence lingering like a suffocating fog. I never stopped to look back. I drove until the first light of dawn broke on the horizon, my heart still pounding in my ears. I reached a familiar town, but the events of that night would never leave me.